Lee Remick never meant to reveal it, but near the end of her life, during an interview that was supposed to be routine, she whispered a single sentence that froze the entire room. I loved him, but it was a love that could never exist. The man she spoke of was Paul Newman, and the on-set connection they tried to bury decades ago would become the one secret that haunted Lee for the rest of her life. On paper, nothing about Paul Newman and Lee Remick should have been dangerous. He was already the blue-eyed legend, the man Hollywood had turned into a symbol of loyalty. The devoted husband to Joanne Woodward, the actor who refused affairs, refused rumors, refused to play the game other men played. She was the quiet force. Lee Remick, fine-boned, soft-voiced, with eyes that always seemed to be carrying a secret. Critics called her delicate, directors knew better. Under that softness was steel. In the late 1962 and early 1972, both of their careers were at a strange crossroads. Paul was transitioning from young leading man to something more complex, darker roles, tougher scripts. He wanted to be taken seriously not just as a pretty face, but as an actor and a director. Lee, on the other hand, was rebuilding. She had already tasted success and disappointment. She knew what it felt like to be praised, then sidelined. She knew what it felt like to stand on a set and realize all the power belonged to the man she was acting opposite. That was the context when they met to work together. The film would be demanding, harsh locations, long hours, emotional scenes that blurred the line between acting and confession. It was exactly the kind of project that attracted Paul. A story about pride, family, and the cost of stubbornness. It was also the kind of script that would expose every crack in the people performing it. From the first screen tests, something was different. The camera did not just like them, it locked onto them. Their scenes together did not feel rehearsed. They felt lived in. Crew members later recalled that Paul adjusted his energy when Lee walked on set. He slowed down. He listened more. The jokes that usually flew around the soundstage went quiet when she was in the room. Not because he was bored, but because he was paying attention in a way that made everyone else feel like background noise. Lee responded to that intensity. She had worked with powerful men before. She knew the arrogance, the casual flirtation, the way some actors used intimacy as a prop. Paul was not like that. He did not hover. He did not touch more than the scene required. He did something much more disarming. He took her seriously. During rehearsals, he would sit with her in a corner, script pages scattered between them, asking what she thought. Not as a courtesy, as if her instinct could make or break the film. "What do you think she's really afraid of in this scene?" he asked once, holding a page with a marital argument marked up in blue. Lee looked at him and answered quietly, "Not being seen. Not really. Being treated like furniture that talks." He didn't respond with a joke. He just nodded. "Then that's where we'll play it," he said. Not at the shouting, at the hurt. It was small moments like that that began to build something no one could name out loud. On camera, their characters clashed, circled, and collided. Off camera, something gentler was forming in the space between takes. A way he would wait for her to finish a thought instead of interrupting. A way she would unconsciously angle her body toward him when they stood in a group. None of this looked scandalous in a photograph. There were no stolen kisses caught by paparazzi. No dramatic midnight confrontations. It was cuter than that. More dangerous because of it, the crew noticed. They always do. Rumors didn't start with anything obvious. They started with patterns. Paul staying longer on the days he had scenes with Lee, even when he could have left. Lee lingering near the monitor after a take, watching not just her performance but his, almost as if she were studying a person, not a character. There were late-night script discussions in hotel lobbies, conversations that started technical and drifted into personal without either of them realizing where the line had been. "How do you play a man who knows he's wrong and won't admit it?" Lee asked him once. Paul looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You don't play it," he said. "You just tell yourself the truth and then refuse to say it out loud. That's all stubbornness is." In that sentence she heard more than a craft note. She heard a kind of confession. Because outside that set, Paul Newman's life was built on a very precise image: the faithful husband, the activist, the man who turned away temptations, who joked about preferring steak at home instead of hamburger out when asked about infidelity. The world believed that line. Joanne believed it because she needed to. Hollywood believed it because it made him safe to worship. But on set, Lee caught glimpses of the man behind that script. The fatigue in his face when the day ended, the way his shoulders dropped when everyone left and the public version of himself was no longer required. The rare moments when he allowed his eyes to stay on her a few seconds longer than good sense allowed, then pulled back as if he had touched a hot stove. That push and pull became the hidden engine of their work. In one key scene, their characters argue in a cramped kitchen, frustration boiling over years of unspoken resentment. The script called for raised voices, a slammed door, a final line delivered like a knife. They rehearsed it once. It felt flat. "Forget the shouting," Lee said quietly between takes. "What if she's not angry? What if she's tired of begging to be loved?" Paul listened. Then, on the next take, he dropped the volume of his performance. He stopped playing the macho defiance the scene seemed to demand. Instead, he let something else slip through guilt. The result was electric. Viewers would later call it one of the most honest scenes in the film. What they didn't know was that for Lee, it no longer felt like two characters talking. It felt like the only place she was allowed to say certain things to him without saying them at all. That is how on-set affairs begin when they are not physical. They begin in rehearsals that run longer than necessary, in shared cigarettes on a freezing location while everyone else waits in the vans, in questions like, "Are you happy?" asked as if it were about the character, when both people know it isn't. Lee Remick was not naive. She knew he had a wife who was not just a spouse but a professional partner. She knew he had a reputation he would never risk. She knew that whatever was unfolding between them had no future. But she also knew how it felt when the cameras stopped and he stayed beside her instead of walking off to be Paul Newman, the icon. On some nights, back at the hotel, the line between fiction and reality blurred in more dangerous ways. They would sit in the bar with the director and a few crew members, glasses half empty, the conversation drifting from the day's rushes to childhood stories. Someone would leave, then someone else. Eventually, it would just be the two of them. Lee would talk about fear, the fear of aging out of roles, the fear of being remembered only for her beauty and not for what she could do on screen. Paul would talk about responsibility, about what it meant to be watched all the time, to be the man strangers projected their fantasies onto, even when he felt like he was barely holding his own life together. "We're both trapped," she said once, not quite joking. "Maybe," he replied, "but we make a good prison scene, don't we?" He smiled, she smiled back, and under the table, both of them kept their hands firmly to themselves. That was the deal neither of them said out loud. Whatever this was could live in glances, in scenes, in late-night conversations that vanished at sunrise. It could live in the safe space of were just working. It could not step beyond that, because on the other side of this film were real lives. A wife who had built a career and a family with him, children who saw their father as a constant, a public that needed to believe at least one Hollywood marriage was unbreakable. Lee understood that, maybe better than anyone. She had seen what happened to women who were blamed for the cracks in powerful men's stories. It was never the man who paid the highest price. So she made a choice. On set, she allowed the truth of what she felt to fuel the performance, the longing, the frustration, the tenderness that could not be named. Off set, she buried it. When the film wrapped, the cast and crew gathered for the usual goodbye drinks. There were speeches, jokes, a few tears. Paul hugged everyone, including Lee, in quick professional embraces. Cameras flashed. Nothing looked unusual. But when the last photo was taken and people began to drift out into the night, there was a moment at the door. "Thank you," he said to her quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For seeing more than you should have," he answered, and not saying it. It was a strange kind of compliment. It was also an admission. The film went out into the world. Critics praised their chemistry. Audiences believed the marriage on screen. The tension, the hurt, the hint of something they could not quite define. They did not know that for Lee Remick, it was not just a role. It was the closest she ever came to a love she was never allowed to live. And from that point on, Paul Newman was no longer just a colleague in her memory. He was the man who stayed frozen in one specific time and place on a set where the cameras recorded everything except the one truth neither of them dared to speak. That truth would not explode in scandals or tabloid headlines. It would do something quieter. It would follow her into every role she took, every interview she gave. Every night she lay awake asking herself the same silent question: what if she had let that love exist, even for a moment? Years later, when journalists asked Lee Remick about that film, she never mentioned what really stayed with her. She talked about the script, about the lighting, about how disciplined Paul Newman was as an actor. She did not talk about the way her chest tightened when she saw his name on the call sheet. That was the hidden truth. The performance ended. The feeling did not. After the shoot, life moved on in the way life always does. New films, new roles, new cities. Paul went back to the carefully curated world that had been built around him for years. Joanne, the children, the charity work, the interviews where he smiled and downplayed his own myth. On the surface, nothing had changed. But for Lee, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't an affair she could point to. No affair had happened. There were no hotel rooms, no scandals, no witnesses. And that was precisely the problem. Because you can walk away from an affair you regret. You cannot walk away from a feeling that never had the chance to become anything at all. In the months after the film's release, Lee began to realize how deeply that on-set connection had carved itself into her. It showed up in places that made no sense, in the way she hesitated before accepting certain scripts, in the way she felt physically tired the moment she stepped into a set where the male lead treated her like a prop. Once you have been really seen, it is difficult to go back to being furniture that speaks. Directors noticed her work becoming keener, more internal. She gave performances where the emotion sat behind the eyes, not in the gestures. Reviewers praised her mysterious. They did not know. They were looking at a woman who had learned what it felt like to stand next to the kind of man she could never actually have. The industry did what it always does. It took her pain and called it depth. Every now and then their paths crossed again. Award shows, charity events, a shared panel at a festival. Publicly they were cordial. Two respected actors greeting each other warmly. The cameras captured smiles, cheek-to-cheek photos, a quick embrace that could be replayed on entertainment shows without fear of controversy. Privately, the silence between them said more than any words could. They did not talk about that shoot. They did not talk about late-night conversations over half-finished drinks, or about the scene where they stopped acting and simply told each other the truth through their characters. Instead, they stuck to safe topics: old colleagues, box office numbers, causes they supported. If anyone had been close enough to listen, they might have thought it was indifference. In reality, it was the only way to keep the past from cracking open in public, because the hidden truth was not that Lee loved Paul more than anyone else. The hidden truth was that he had given her a glimpse of a version of herself she couldn't keep. On that film, she wasn't just playing the wife, the mother, the woman, holding everything together while the man broke down. She was treated as an equal, as someone whose instincts shaped the story, as someone whose presence changed the room, and once it ended, she had to go back to a world where that was not always true. In some interviews years later, when her guard was down for a moment, fragments slipped through. "There was a man I worked with who made me feel less alone," she said once, staring off past the interviewer's shoulder. You don't forget that, even if it was only ever about the work. She didn't say his name, she didn't have to. The cost of that kind of connection is not paid on the set. It is paid in the quiet years afterward. It shows up when you sit in a dressing room decades later, looking at yourself in the mirror and wondering how many of your choices were yours and how many were shaped by one person you never fully admitted you loved. For Lee, the consequence wasn't scandal, it was comparison. Other men became harder to believe. Compliments felt lighter. Promises sounded thinner. The standard had been set by a relationship that never officially existed. Meanwhile, Paul Newman carried his own version of that truth. He was not a man who confessed easily. He believed in action, in loyalty, in showing up rather than talking. But the human heart does not care about public narratives. It does not know the difference between love you are allowed to feel and love you are not. In certain roles he took after that film, something in him grew sharper, more self-aware. The men he played were flawed, conflicted, haunted by choices they refused to name. Audiences called it maturity. Critics called it complexity. But when he stood alone in his study late at night, scripts spread out on the desk, it was not the reviews he thought about. It was the memory of a woman who had once asked him, in a character's voice but with her own eyes, "Why won't you tell the truth?" And he had never answered. Not really. He could justify it easily. He owed his wife stability. He owed his children a father who didn't set their lives on fire to chase a feeling. He owed his image consistency, because an image that cracks once may never recover. But beneath all those obligations, there was a more selfish fear. What if he let that feeling out of its box and discovered that it was the only real thing he had? What would that say about everything he had built? So he did what disciplined men do when they are afraid of themselves. He compartmentalized. Lee Remick became a chapter he never reread, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. For her, the weight was different. She did not have an empire to protect. She had a career, a personal life, a body that aged, a face that the camera loved and then slowly began to betray under harsher lighting. Hollywood demands that women reinvent themselves to stay. It does not reward them for holding on to unresolved feelings. So she turned that unresolved feeling into work. She accepted roles where the women loved men they could not keep, where the marriage was broken before the story began, where the most important words were the ones never spoken out loud. Viewers felt an H in her performances they couldn't quite explain. It was not theatrical tragedy. It was something quieter. The H of a woman who knew exactly what it meant to stand on the edge of a decision she would never make. Friends noticed that in private she did not dramatize her past. She did not tell long romantic stories. When asked about regrets, she rarely mentioned names. What she talked about instead was timing. How many things in our lives are just about timing, she once said over dinner to a colleague. The right person at the wrong moment. The right truth when you're still too cowardly to say it. She laughed when she said it, but it wasn't a funny line. In her later years, as interviews shifted from current projects to retrospectives, questions about her most meaningful collaboration became more frequent. Sometimes she dodged them. Sometimes she gave safe answers, directors, actresses she admired, a particularly demanding play. And then there were the rare moments when she allowed a crack to show. There was one film, she admitted in a late television interview, eyes slightly glassy under the studio lights, where the work and my life became very tangled. The host leaned forward, with whom she smiled the way people smile when they've reached the border of what they are willing to say. With someone the price paysy, the world already thinks it knows, she replied. I preferred to keep the rest for myself. That was the closest she ever came to naming him. The true scandal in this story is not betrayal, it is restraint. Hollywood is built on explosions. Cheating scandals, divorces, public meltdowns. People know how to process that. They can point, judge, move on. What they do not know how to handle is a love that never erupts, a love that behaves, a love that wears the mask of professionalism so perfectly that only two people ever know it was there at all. That was Lee Remick's hidden truth. She was not destroyed by a man who used her and left. She was haunted by a man who never used her, never left, and never truly arrived. He stayed lodged in one corner of her memory, standing under hot set lights, holding a script, eyes meeting hers for a second too long, then looking away. In the end, when illness came and time began to run out, she did not suddenly change her story. There was no deathbed confession, no tell-all memoir with his name in bold. What she did instead was far more revealing. She chose a single sentence. I loved him, but it was a love that could never exist. No names, no dates, just enough truth to free herself and just enough secrecy to protect him. Because the final, quiet reality was this. For Lee Remick, Paul Newman was not the man who broke her life. He was the man who stayed forever unfinished. And sometimes, the loves we never complete are the ones that shape us the most. The biggest shock did not surface while Lee Remick was alive. It surfaced when someone finally opened the boxes she left behind. After her death, a small team of archivists and producers was granted access to her personal papers for a planned retrospective. They expected old contracts, faded call sheets, maybe a few handwritten notes about roles, the usual debris of a long career. What they didn't expect was a separate carton, taped twice, with a label in her own handwriting, private, not for public use. Inside, everything was meticulously ordered, folders arranged by decade, scripts with margins full of tiny, precise annotations, Polaroids from sets long forgotten by the public. And then in the middle of the 1960 segundo and 70 segundo section, one thin, overstuffed file. The title on the tab was not the film's name. It was a date range. The months they shot together. When the folder was opened, a pattern appeared. Call sheets with his name circled. Scene pages where all of his dialogue had been underlined. A hotel notepad with 3 words written over and over in blue ink, "Don't let it show." But the most disturbing item was not a script page. It was a letter, unsent, Folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. At the top, in her familiar hand, one line, "I will never send this, and that is why I can tell the truth." What followed was not the confession of a scandalous affair. There were no graphic details, no secret meetings in hotel rooms. It was something more unsettling, the testimony of a woman who knew she had crossed a line without ever touching him. She wrote about walking onto set and feeling the air change when he turned toward her, about the way their scenes felt less like acting and more like slipping into a version of herself she couldn't safely be anywhere else. Then, halfway down the page, a sentence that made the archivist stop reading out loud. "I began to fall in love with him, not as a man I could have, but as a man I could only hold inside the frame." She described that film as an emotional betrayal of my own life, not because anything happened, but because something in her shifted permanently. "I stayed faithful in every visible way," she wrote, "and I was still unfaithful in my heart." The letter never mentions his name, but it doesn't need to. She refers to those pale blue eyes the world thinks it owns, to the wife whose name appears beside his in reviews, to the way he carried guilt like a second skin and hid it behind jokes. No one had to guess who she meant. The shock was not that Lee Remick once loved Paul Newman. The shock was how clearly she understood that no one would ever be allowed to say it. At the bottom of the letter, beneath paragraphs of restraint and self-criticism, she wrote one last line, "I will not ruin his story to save mine." She signed it, dated it, folded it back into the folder, and never mailed it. For years, that might have been dismissed as one-sided, a private confession, a projection, the heart of an actress attaching itself to the safest impossible man in the room. Except there was something else. On the other side of the country, in a different archive, an old audio tape sat in a box labeled simply "Unbroadcast," 1982. It was a raw recording from a long-form television interview with Paul Newman, the kind of conversation from which only fragments had ever aired. The rest had been stored away, too personal, too meandering, not tight enough for prime time. Near the end of the tape, the interviewer's voice softened. "Was there ever a performance," he asked, "where the work and your life got a little tangled?" There was a long silence, longer than usual, the sound of someone lighting a cigarette, exhaling. "Yeah," Paul finally said, "there was." "Can you say which film I'd rather not?" he replied. "The actress is still alive, or at least she was when we shot it. She gave me more than she should have," the interviewer tried to push. Romantically, Paul laughed once, without humor. "No, that would have been easier," he said. "We kept it all inside the work. That's the part that scared me. You go home at night and realize you've felt something real in a place where you're supposed to be pretending." He never said her name. But then he added one detail. "She had these eyes," he said, quietly. "Always looked like she'd just decided not to cry. That'll break you faster than any affair." For anyone who knew Lee Remick's face, the description was unmistakable. The tape was never broadcast. It was logged, stored, forgotten. Only when the two sets of evidence were placed side by side, her unsent letter and his unreleased admission, did the full outline of the story emerge. This was not the usual Hollywood scandal. No one left their marriage. No one filed for divorce. No tabloid ran a cover plastered with grainy photos and red arrows pointing at matching hotel entrances. Instead, what emerged was a different kind of betrayal. He betrayed nothing publicly and everything privately. She betrayed no vows, but she stopped being entirely available to her own life. The biggest shock was not that something had happened between them. It was that something had almost happened, and they both understood years later that almost had been enough to alter the course of two lives. For viewers who had long worshipped the mythology of Paul Newman as the man immune to onset temptation, this was a fracture, not a collapse, but a crack that would never quite close. He had always insisted he didn't sleep around. He never claimed he didn't feel. For fans of Lee Remick, the revelation was even more painful. The stoic elegance, the wounded dignity in her later performances, the way she seemed to carry a private H in every glance, it no longer looked like pure technique. It looked like a woman who had once loved in the only space where she was allowed to between action and cut. What do you do with a love that exists only on film and in two pieces of paper never meant to be seen together? You could dismiss it as projection. You could argue that actors blur lines all the time. Or you could accept the simple, uncomfortable conclusion: the on-set affair that changed everything did not need to be physical to be real. It lived in the work. It lived in the choices they both made afterward. It lived in an unsent letter in one archive and an unheard confession in another. And once those two hidden fragments were finally brought into the same frame, the story of Paul Newman and Lee Remick could never again be watched as just another performance. In the end, nothing explosive happened. No affair exposed, no divorce filed, no scandal big enough to make headlines, and yet the quietus stories are sometimes the ones that leave the deepest scars. The legacy of Paul Newman and Lee Remick is not written in betrayal, but in restraint, the kind of restraint that rewrites the interior lives of the people who practice it. For Lee, the cost was measured in silence. She carried herself with grace through every decade that followed, but a part of her remained tied to a single stretch of months, the time when she stood beside a man who saw her in a way that no one else ever truly would. She never resented him for choosing his life over their connection. She understood the boundaries better than anyone. But understanding does not erase feeling. It only teaches you how to bury it with dignity. And for Paul, the burden was different. He returned to the life he had vowed to protect, the image he had spent years shaping, the marriage he refused to destabilize. He honored those commitments. But somewhere behind the polished public persona was the memory of an actress who forced him to confront a cuter truth. Even the most disciplined men have moments where the heart pulls in a direction the world cannot see. Neither of them broke anything. Neither of them healed entirely. Their unfinished connection, preserved only in an unsent letter and an unreleased confession, reminds us of something uncomfortable, that some relationships exist not to be lived, but to change us. Hollywood likes its stories loud. It prefers chaos, betrayal, dramatic endings. But the truth between Newman and Remick was more human than that. It was about two people who recognized something dangerous in each other and chose to protect everything else they loved by walking away from it. And perhaps that is the real moral here. Not every love must be acted upon to matter. Not every connection needs a physical boundary to be considered real. Some of the most powerful emotional bonds are the ones that never cross the line, and precisely because they never do, they carve themselves deeper into the people who carry them. In the final calculation, Lee Remick did not lose him. She kept him in the only place he could safely exist in memory, in art, in the performance that changed her forever. And Paul Newman did what the world expected him to do. He remained loyal, responsible, admired. But a part of him stayed behind on that set, locked inside, a moment he never allowed himself to name. So the story ends not with scandal, but with a question that lingers long after the credits. Fate, what is the true price of the love we never allow ourselves to live?